For 23 years, Joyce Freeman believed her uncle, Bishop Howard, had simply abandoned his faith and fled the diocese. The official story of a personal crisis never sat right with her, but with no evidence. His file gathered dust. That is, until a construction foreman calls her about a discovery on old church property, a sealed Cold War-era bunker containing a single, horrifying object. A giant crucifix, one she recognizes from her uncle's cathedral, lies submerged in a pool of crude oil, a deliberate act of desecration. It's a story that asks how well we truly know the people we trust and what secrets can lie buried just beneath the surface of our quiet communities. If tales of long-hidden truths intrigue you, stick around and let us know in the comments what you think about this incredible discovery. The morning of May 18, 2007, began like any other for Joyce Freeman. The air in the diocesan archives was cool and still, smelling of aging paper and lemon polish. For Joyce, this quiet, ordered world was a refuge. It was a place where history was neatly filed and every question had an answer tucked away in a labeled box. It was the exact opposite of the one great, unanswered question of her life. What really happened to her uncle? Bishop Howard had been more than an uncle. He had been a father to her after her own parents passed away. He was a man of deep, unwavering faith and profound kindness. The idea that he would simply walk away from his life's work, from his flock, from her, felt like a fiction. Yet that was the story the church had settled on. A sudden crisis of faith, a quiet departure to live a secular life elsewhere. For 23 years, that story had echoed in the hollow space he left behind, a wound that never quite healed for Joyce. The sharp ring of the telephone cut through the silence. Joyce picked it up, expecting a routine query from a parish historian. The voice on the other end was rough, unfamiliar. "Is this Joyce Freeman?" he asked. "My name is Donald. I'm the foreman on the old St. Jude's Retreat property. The diocese sold it to us a few months back. We're clearing the land for a new housing development, and, well, we found something. Something you should probably see." An hour later, Joyce was pulling her car onto a muddy track on the far west side of the county. The old retreat center had been abandoned since the late 70s, and nature had thoroughly reclaimed it. Donald, a stout man in a hard hat and dusty jeans, was waiting for her by a large yellow bulldozer. He led her past a pile of uprooted trees to a clearing. There, set into a small hill, was a thick steel door, its edges scarred with the bright, clean marks of a cutting torch. "It's a fallout shelter, we think," Donald said, his voice low. "Built back in the 50s or 60s. According to the old plans, it was supposed to be empty. It was welded shut from the outside. My guys had to work on it for an hour to get it open." A wave of stale, chemical-scented air washed over Joyce as she approached the dark opening. Donald handed her a heavy-duty flashlight. "Watch your step," he warned. She clicked on the beam and peered inside. The flashlight cut a path through the darkness, revealing a square room of bare, damp concrete. In the center of the room was a pit, and in that pit was a pool of something thick, black, and glistening. Her light traced the surface of the dark liquid until it landed on the object submerged within. Joyce's breath caught in her throat. It was a crucifix. Not just any crucifix, but a massive, 8-foot-tall wooden cross bearing a figure of Christ, hand-carved from dark oak. She knew it instantly. She had spent countless hours as a child staring up at that very cross in the city's main cathedral. Its details were etched into her memory. The specific grain of the wood, a small chip near the base from when it was once dropped during cleaning. But seeing it here, in this cold, dark tomb, drowned in what smelled like crude oil, it was a vision from a nightmare. This wasn't just misplaced property. This was a statement, an act of profound hatred. The official story of her uncle's quiet departure shattered into a million pieces. This was no crisis of faith. This was a murder scene. And as she stood there, the flashlight trembling in her hand, Joyce knew her life's new purpose was to find the person responsible. The police arrived, and the bunker was immediately sealed off as a crime scene. The lead investigator was a calm, methodical man named Detective Mark. He listened patiently as Joyce explained the significance of the crucifix and its connection to her uncle's disappearance in 1984. While he was professional, Joyce could see the skepticism in his eyes. A 23-year-old cold case was a long shot, and a missing cross wasn't a body. But for Joyce, the link was undeniable. With a new fire lit within her, Joyce returned to her sanctuary, the archives. She was no longer just a keeper of records, she was an investigator. Detective Mark had promised to keep her informed, but he was dealing with the physical evidence. Joyce had access to the paper trail, the history that someone had tried so hard to bury. Her first search was for the property records of the old retreat. She found a work order dated October 1986, 2 years after her uncle vanished. It was a simple directive from the diocese chancellor at the time, ordering the fallout shelter to be permanently sealed for safety reasons. The property was then left to decay until its recent sale. Whoever had hidden the crucifix knew it would be sealed away, untouched, for decades. Next, she pulled the file on the crucifix itself. A report filed a week after Bishop Howard's disappearance stated that the cross had been stolen during a nighttime break-in at the cathedral. There were no suspects, no witnesses. The case was closed within a month. It had been treated as a simple random act of vandalism. No one had connected the theft of the church's most important symbol with the disappearance of its leader. Joyce then turned to the events of May 14, 1984, the day her uncle was last seen. He had presided over a diocesan council meeting that afternoon. She found the official minutes, typed and bound in a leather folder. They were unremarkable, detailing budget approvals and parish appointments. But Joyce knew that official records rarely told the whole story. She dug deeper, searching for the raw materials, the secretary's shorthand notes, the draft agendas. Tucked into a folder of miscellaneous papers, she found them. On the back of a draft page, a hastily scribbled note in pencil caught her eye. It was just 3 words: "Asks our dispute." Her heart began to beat faster. Accounts. A dispute. And the initial R. She scanned the official attendee list from the meeting. There were 4 priests whose names started with R, but one stood out immediately: Deacon Ronald. At the time, Ronald was a young, brilliant, and universally loved figure in the diocese. He was known for his passionate sermons and his tireless charity work. Bishop Howard had taken him under his wing, treating him like a son and positioning him as a future leader. After the bishop's disappearance, it was Ronald who had delivered the most moving homily, speaking of his mentor's tormented but brilliant soul. Today, Monsignor Ronald was one of the most powerful men in the diocese, leading a wealthy parish in the suburbs. Joyce moved to the financial archives, a section she knew better than her own home. She pulled the heavy, leather-bound ledgers for 1983 and 1984. It took her hours, but she found it, a separate account, labeled the St. Jude's Missionary Fund. It had been established by Ronald to support impoverished communities overseas. The deposits were consistent, but the withdrawals were large, sporadic, and authorized with a signature that, while similar to Bishop Howard's, looked slightly off to Joyce's trained eye. The fund was closed, and its remaining balance transferred to the general diocesan account in December of 1984, 7 months after her uncle was gone. The reason cited was administrative restructuring. It was all too neat. Joyce knew she was onto something, but she had no proof, just a series of coincidences that painted a deeply unsettling picture. The priests from that meeting were all either deceased or in failing health. Ronald was the only one left who was still active and sharp. She knew she couldn't approach him directly. She needed more. She needed a human element, a witness who saw something more than just numbers in a book. She went back to the personnel files from 1984, looking for anyone who worked in the bishop's office. That's when she found the name Shirley. She had been Bishop Howard's executive secretary for over a decade. Her file noted she had resigned abruptly in July 1984, just 2 months after the bishop vanished, citing family health issues. It was a common, discreet reason to leave a job. Joyce did some digging and found a current address for a Shirley who matched the age. She lived in a quiet retirement community an hour's drive north. The next day, Joyce sat in a floral print armchair across from a small, frail woman with kind but fearful eyes. Shirley remembered Joyce as a little girl running through the halls of the chancery. At first she was warm, reminiscing about the old days. But when Joyce gently brought up the events of May 1984, a shudder fell over Shirley's face. "It was a difficult time for everyone," she said, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed the blanket on her lap. "I know this is hard," Joyce said softly, "but I found the cathedral crucifix. It was hidden. I think my uncle was murdered, Shirley, and I think it had something to do with that meeting." Tears welled in Shirley's eyes. For 23 years, she had carried a secret, a burden of fear that had defined the rest of her life. She told Joyce that on the afternoon of the meeting, she had been working late. She heard shouting from the bishop's office. It was Bishop Howard and Deacon Ronald. Their voices were sharp with anger. She couldn't make out all the words, but she clearly heard the bishop say, "The fund is a lie, Ronald. The money is gone." He had discovered the embezzlement. He gave Ronald an ultimatum: confess to the council and make arrangements to repay the money, or he would be stripped of his duties and turned over to the authorities that very evening. Ronald was pleading, his voice desperate. That was the last time Shirley ever saw Bishop Howard. A few days later, a calm and composed Deacon Ronald approached her. He told her the bishop had decided to take a long, private retreat to deal with some personal demons. He then looked her straight in the eye and said that for the good of the church and for her own well-being, her silence on the matter of their argument was essential. The message was clear. It wasn't a request. It was a threat. Terrified, Shirley wrote her letter of resignation the next day and never looked back. Joyce drove back to the city, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. She now had the final piece of the puzzle. It wasn't just a dispute over accounts. It was motive for murder. She called Detective Mark and told him everything. With a credible witness testimony backing up the financial evidence, he finally had what he needed. They agreed to confront Monsignor Ronald together. They arrived at the pristine, manicured grounds of Ronald's parish as the sun was setting. The church was a grand, modern building of glass and stone, a testament to the wealth and influence he had built over the past 2 decades. They found him in his office, a spacious room with mahogany furniture and a large window overlooking a garden. He was now in his late 60s with a full head of silver hair and the same charismatic smile Joyce remembered from her youth. He greeted them with an air of paternal concern. "Joyce, what a surprise. And Detective Mark. To what do I owe this visit?" he asked, gesturing for them to sit. Detective Mark began, but Joyce couldn't wait. "We found him," she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of grief and rage. "We found my uncle." Ronald's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. Has there been news?" "We found the cathedral crucifix," Joyce continued, her eyes locked on his, "in a sealed bunker, submerged in oil, an act of desecration. The kind of thing someone would do if they hated the man and everything he stood for." The Monsignor's face became a mask of pious sorrow. "My dear, that is horrifying. Vandals, no doubt. The same ones who broke in all those years ago. What does this have to do with the bishop's retreat?" "We know about the argument," Detective Mark said, his voice firm. "We know about the St. Jude's Missionary Fund. We know about the money you stole." Ronald stiffened, but he didn't break. He began to deliver a calm, practiced denial, speaking of misunderstandings and the burdens of leadership. But as he spoke, Joyce saw not a man of God, but a performer, an actor who had been playing a role for 23 years. "We spoke to Shirley," Joyce said quietly. At the mention of the secretary's name, all the color drained from Ronald's face. The performance stopped. The mask fell. In that moment, Joyce saw him for what he was, a cornered killer. He slumped back in his leather chair, the weight of his long-held secret finally crushing him. He confessed everything. The argument had continued after the meeting, moving from the office down to the cathedral basement. He had pleaded with Howard, begged him not to ruin his life, his calling. But the bishop was resolute. The crime was not just against the church, but against the poor people the money was meant for. In a fit of panicked rage, Ronald had grabbed a heavy silver candlestick from a storage shelf and struck the bishop from behind. Realizing what he had done, he descended into a cold, calculated cover-up. He hid the body on the abandoned retreat property, and a week later he returned to the cathedral at night. He stole the crucifix, a symbol of the authority and faith he had so profoundly betrayed. He dragged it to the bunker, poured drums of stolen oil over it, and sealed the door, burying his sin in the dark. Police placed Monsignor Ronald in handcuffs. The news of his arrest and the murder of a beloved bishop by one of his own sent a shockwave of disbelief and horror through the entire faith community. Months later, acting on the details of Ronald's confession, authorities found Bishop Howard's remains buried in a shallow, unmarked grave not far from the bunker. He was finally given the funeral he deserved, laid to rest as a man of honor, his name cleared of the quiet shame that had clung to it for over 2 decades. Joyce stood at the graveside, a quiet peace settling over her for the first time in her adult life. The archives she kept were finally complete. The story had an ending. The truth, however ugly, was finally on the record. Ronald committed a terrible crime, but he also continued to serve his community for over 20 years, doing what many considered to be good work. This brings up a difficult question. Does a person's good deeds have any value if they are built on a foundation of a horrific, unconfessed crime? We'd be fascinated to hear your thoughts on this in the comments below. If you found this journey into a long-buried secret compelling, consider subscribing and joining our community of story enthusiasts. We have many more histories to uncover together.